showing all of the bloopers and that sort of thing, and it's pretty entertaining. But in any event, they launched, and today, of course, there are all kinds of copycats and imitators. It's not unusual now. We're very much accustomed to having TV whenever we want it, daylight, dark, night, morning, doesn't really matter, because of the technology that's available. The instant coverage is nice. It certainly helps us to stay informed because we have access to worldwide events almost as soon as they happen. Unfortunately, a lot of times what we're looking at is suffering. You may be seeing the effects of a hurricane down in the Gulf, or an earthquake in Japan, or forest fires in California. There are all kinds of things. Recently, there was a bad tornado up in Tennessee. A number of people lost their life. We got wall-to-wall coverage about that because of the cable, technology. So these are things that remind us, and then not to mention the pandemic that we're in the midst of right now, which is also filling up the news time as it should be, something that's that impactful all the way around the world. So all of these things are at our fingertips, and we see it. We see people suffering somewhere every day. And it's real suffering. If it's, impacting me or impacting you, for us it's real. And the ways that it can change our lives and impact is also very real. And it becomes very personal in that regard, and that's certainly true with the coverage we're seeing on the coronavirus and everything that it, is presenting us with. The mask, the gloves, things that 4 or 5 weeks ago you would have never imagined you were having to do. But now you have to do it, and fortunately, as the case may be, misery loves company, because there are people all around the world having to do the same sort of thing. Our scripture today and our lesson today, as the title suggests, is about the end of the kingdom of Judah. It's found in the second book of Kings, over in the 25th chapter, and it will reveal to us also some real suffering encountered by those people who inhabited that small nation of Judah. It will include things like the fall of Jerusalem, thanks to the invasion from the Babylonians, all kinds of suffering on a massive scale, which would forever change the lives of those people. And we'll be reading about that shortly, and see the impact as the scripture writer laid it out for us. In our lesson, before we do that, the writer talks about different aspects of suffering, and he describes this, event in Judah as a very sad yet powerful story with important meaning for us today. And that's really the purpose, in my mind, of most any Sunday school lesson, is how it can be a outlet that will bring more meaning today in our lives. So hopefully we'll be able to say we've done a little bit of that when we get through. In setting the stage, I give us a little information prior to where the scripture begins. Scripture is going to begin with the 8th verse in chapter 25. But prior to that, there's a little background information. And in looking into this, one of the things that's done is there's a description of Judah's last 5 kings, sort of a recap. And I wanted to share that because I think that's relevant to what the writer of the lesson is trying to help us see. First one was a fellow named Josiah. Josiah was in a league of his own because he's the only one in the five that really amounted to very much as far as kingship was concerned. He's described as a righteous man, but he was killed by one of the pharaohs of Egypt who shot him with a bow and arrow, which you don't hear of too much today, but that was his fate. And from that point on, things really went downhill in Judah as far as leadership. The last four kings did not really manage things very well. The second one after was a guy named Jehoaz. He was around for only 3 months. Then again, another pharaoh put him in prison. Then we have a fellow named Jehoiakim. Excuse my pronunciation here, but this is the best that I can do. Jehoiakim was Jehoaz's brother, and he reigned for 11 years, which again put him in a sort of a special class because of the longevity. Most of that time, though, he was a vassal of Egypt, which, brushing up on your world history days in the Middle Ages, you know that if you were somebody's vassal, you pretty much were at their beck and call, and that was the situation. He was not a very popular leader. He kept moving his loyalties back and forth from Egypt to Babylon, Babylon back to Egypt, trying really to avoid an invasion by either one of those powers. And he gets criticized pretty strongly in the book of Jeremiah, there in the Old Testament as well. Ultimately, Nebuchadnezzar comes along. This is Nebuchadnezzar the second, if we're being particular. He invades Judah and kills Jehoiakim. I did not realize it, but there were a series of something like 7 or 8 different invasions prior to the final one that we'll be reading about in a moment, and this was one of those. Next gentleman was named Jehoiachin, C-H-I-N. He was from the Chinese side of the family. Not really, just kidding. He also was a vassal, but he was a vassal of Babylon. He too only ruled for like 3 months. And then there was another one of these invasions. He survived as far as living and dying. He lived, but he was taken back to Babylon and thrown into prison. But we'll have more to say about him a little later because ultimately he did survive and was released. The final one that we mentioned here, number 5, is a gentleman named Zedekiah. Zedekiah was an uncle of Jehoiachin. And he was, as was normal for a lot of people in those days, he was sort of backed and installed in the position by a foreign power. Excuse me. That being Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. So eventually, again, the Babylonians come back. They attack Jerusalem. This is the massive attack that we're more familiar with. They used battering rams to break down the walls. They exposed the people to starvation, which led to a famine, which made the starvation even worse, and obviously made it easier to overcome or defeat these folks because of the physical, being unable to eat and have food available. They were not physically able to resist as they might have been otherwise. So it was pretty easy to take over. As the walls were penetrated, the Judeans fled the city. They went out in the desert. They ultimately were caught by the Babylonians. Zedekiah was caught. He became a prisoner of war, was arrested, and was given an unbelievably grotesque sentence after his capture. He was forced to sit there and watch his sons be killed. That was basically his penalty, if you will. Then he had his eyes gouged out, and eventually he was taken to Babylon and obviously died from the physical punishment that he was exposed to. And that sets the stage for our scripture, which is what I want to do right now is read this. It's verses 8 through 21 in chapter 25 of 2 Kings. So, on the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, commander of the imperial guard and official of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building was burned down. The whole Babylonian army, under the command of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had gone over to the king of Babylon. But the commander did leave behind some of the poorest people of the land to work in the vineyards and the fields. The Babylonians broke up bronze pillars in the temple, the movable stands, and the bronze sea, all that were a part of the temple of the Lord. And they carried the bronze with them to Babylon. They also took away pots, shovels, wick trimmers, dishes, and all the bronze articles used in the temple service. The commander of the imperial guard took away the censers and sprinkling bowls, all of which were made of pure gold and silver. So there's a lot of valuable material there that was preserved, but it was also hauled off to Babylon along with the people. The bronze from the two pillars and the sea and the movable stands which Solomon had made for the temple was more than could be weighed. So we're obviously talking about substantial wealth or value. Each pillar was 27 feet high. The bronze capital on top of one pillar was 4.5 feet high and was decorated with a network and pomegranates of bronze all around. The other pillar with its network was similar. The commander of the guard took as prisoners Sariah, the chief priest, Zephaniah, the priest next in rank, and the 3 doorkeepers. All those still in the city he took, and the officer, he took the officer, all of those in the city, he took the officer in charge of the fighting men and 5 royal advisors. He also took the secretary, who was chief officer, in charge of conscripting the people of the land, and 60 of his men who were found in the city. Nebuzaradan, the commander, took them all and brought them to the king of Babylon at Ribah. There at Ribah in the land of Hamath, the king had them executed. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. That's the last verse. So Judah went into captivity away from her land. That's also the key verse in our lesson, and in the translation in the lesson, I think it's even more impactful. Judah was exiled from his land. Just think about what we're saying there. Judah was exiled from his land. Doesn't get much bleaker than that, I would expect. The 2 main effects of the events that we just read about. First was the degree of destruction as far as Judah was concerned. Civil, economic, military, political, religious life, all of these things utterly destroyed. What few symbols remained, as we found, were taken back into captivity along with the people. Taken to a foreign land. As far as they knew, that was it. And again, that's pretty grim. These are the folks, or at least descendants of the folks who had experienced the great escape, if you will, from Egypt, only to become now victims who would be exiled in the Babylonian. Excuse me.